bridge collapsed. The mountain road washed out. All the signs are obscured by fog. Your only directions are detours. Eventually it dawns on you. Sometimes you need to get lost to discover where you're supposed to be. Welcome to Merlin's Barn.
Welcome to another episode of Merlin's Barn. Tonight you have myself and
Hello, this is Matt. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good night, whichever one you prefer.
Happy New Year. And tonight what we're going to discuss is, I keep saying tonight, today, whichever.
It's tonight for us.
It's tonight for us. It's tonight for us. And we're sitting in Fort Blanket, which is our attempt at soundproofing. I'm sorry for the continued echo. We're working on it. But we're broadcasting from the barn as usual. And tonight we're going to do a ramble on tools. Because I've been working with friends on different projects over the past week. We've been working on vintage radios. We've been working on my Jeep, which has decided to hate me, but we'll leave that beside the point right now. And in the process, we've been digging out more and more of the tools in this building. Now, my family, since going back 120 years, been people who worked with tools. And what happens when you have a giant barn and you're the person in the family who has the giant barn filled with workshops is all of the family heirlooms end up here. And those include the family tools. So upstairs, we were sitting up in the hayloft a couple days ago, playing a game on the giant screen. We have a movie theater up there. And a friend of mine looks over and sees these giant trunks stacked on top of each other and was admiring them. And so we went over and opened them up and I showed them to him because years ago, it was back in the 80s, our furnace went. We lived up in Massachusetts at the time, and our furnace went while my mother and sister were thankfully off visiting folks in Spokane, Washington. And my father orders a furnace, and my grandfather comes down from New Hampshire in the 1967 Chrysler Town and Country, loaded with these giant chests of tools, and pulls out gigantic wrenches, gigantic taps and dies, and starts making pipe and working with my dad on installing this furnace. And then years later, my father inherited them and was using them for something else. And he says to me, I never understood why your grandfather had all of these gigantic tools. And I said to him, well, you have your grandfather's boiler engineering certificate from sometime in the teens. I said, think about the boilers and the tubes in them and what size tools you needed for them. And so a few years down the line, I get a call from my parents as they've moved to another house in New England, and they want me the next time I come up there to take the giant trunks of tools with me. And that's how we ended up with my great-grandfather's tools up in the loft, which was quite an exercise, actually, because you can't physically move those trunks with the tools in them. You have to take all the tools out. In this case, we took all the tools out, and we put the trunks in my four-door Jeep. Then we loaded them with tools, and I think the Jeep was somewhat unhappy about carrying them all from New England. Then got them down here and had to unload all the tools again, lower a hoist from the hayloft because the house is on the second floor, up in 2/3 of the hayloft. We still have all the hatches for throwing the hay down to the animals, and we have a hoist with an electric winch in one of those for bringing things upstairs. So we had to put groups and groupings of tools on these hoists, lift them upstairs, and then lift the actual trunks up and repack them. So they are now a monument in the hayloft. And as I moved in here, a lot of other tools came with me. We had to clear out my grandparents' house in New Hampshire at one point, and brought down my grandfather's drill press, his bench grinder. And this past week, I was rearranging tools in the building because we're creating another section of the building that's just going to be an electronics workshop. So a bunch of my grandfather's tools are now on a workbench in my main shop. which is just awesome to sit there and look at this workbench and go and stare at it and go, okay, my grandfather used this drill press. My grandfather used this bench grinder. The vise on the bench was actually made here in this town, Littlestown, PA, and says it on the side. And then the electronics shop that we're setting up for working on antique radios and such is also going to be filled with my grandfather's tools. And including an oscilloscope that was his, and including a neat set of drawers that when I cleared out his house about 20 years ago, I found this little box, and it was filled with little diaries. And when he was a teenager, he kept a daily diary. And I can actually find in his diaries when he made this set of drawers, because in the 1920s he was really getting into radios as they were developing, and I did my Latin homework, then I got on my bicycle, I rode one town over to so-and-so's electronics shop, I bought some of these, and then there's a few evenings where he talks about building this set of drawers. It was actually after we cleared out his house and had sold it that I found mention of those drawers in his diaries and called up my parents. My mother called up the fellow who had bought the house because we hadn't grabbed those drawers. And he was absolutely wonderful. He said, "I know exactly where those are." He says, "Come up and get them whenever you want." So there's sort of a cornerstone of what's going to be an electronics shop. And since my grandfather designed tubes for tube radios in the 1930s and 40s, it's going to be very fitting that the workshop in there is going to be the sort of tube radio and electronics shop. In fact, he was even one of the designers of the radar tubes during the war. If you don't know what a tube is, it looks a lot like a light bulb, and it's why radios were bigger back in the day. If you do a little bit of Google search on like 1920s radios, you'll see there are all these big things. And it's because they had a bunch of these light bulb looking things in them, which were what made them receive and amplify. And then in the 50s, we came up with transistors, and things became so much smaller. And now we have everything in our phone. But do you have any family tools like that, Matt?
So not really. The couple of my grandfather's kind of hand tools, but unfortunately, so he actually worked on radios, worked on radar and radios in World War II. Then worked for Raytheon Corporation. Was actually a radio and television repairman and had all his tools. But when he retired, he got rid of all of his tools.
Okay. And actually, I forgot we had a discussion a while back where there's a possibility that both of our grandfathers may have worked in the same place.
Yeah.
Because where did he work in Massachusetts?
Yeah, it would have been the Massachusetts location. I just saw his business card the other day in my files. Is it Apple, Massachusetts?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure where my grandfather was at this point. And I got too quiet. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. But so I live in a building filled with tools, and as we've been digging through the tools this week, I've been thinking about tools and then stories of people who work with tools. So I have 3 stories off the top of my head for you tonight. We're going to delve into the world of the Amish a couple of times. And then one story is just going to be one of those stories that comes down to, we've talked about in episodes, we talk about the end of episodes, detours. And just taking those detours where just you've got a gut instinct to go somewhere or do something, and then you find something amazing. So the first story is years ago, before I even lived in this town. I went on a day trip with a friend. We met down in Baltimore where I lived, and we drove through Littlestown, PA, up to Newville, Pennsylvania, where there's a recreated 100-acre World War I battlefield. Yes, I do lots of weird things, which is why I've been told to record them and tell them to you folks. So we go up there and we're talking about how it'd be really cool if we had our own sawmill for cutting the wood for the site, because when you're recreating a World War I battlefield, you're building structures, you're building trench works and stuff like that. And we're talking about the old 19th century sawmills. and how I've seen them operating at like steam shows and stuff like that. And we come back and we're driving through Littlestown, and we pass a restaurant that's still here called La Bella Italia. And out in front is this massive old Dodge truck, probably 1970s crew cab, and it has a massive trailer behind it, a big flatbed that has one of those sawmills strapped down to it in pieces. We drive by it, and my friend Rob Zienta looks at me and goes, Merlin? I said, yes. He says, is that the type of sawmill that we've spent all day talking about? And I said, yeah, that's it. He says, should we perhaps turn around and go meet the people who have the sawmill? Yeah, I guess we've been talking about it all day. We should just see, we should see if we can figure out who has this thing. So we turn around, we go back, and there's two little old men sitting at a table. And they were just the absolute neatest story because they were the only people in the restaurant. And we walk up to them, and I said, are you the guys with the sawmill out in the parking lot? And one of them looks up from his meal, and he says, oh, yes, that's ours. That's our second one, actually.
Ooh.
Yeah. And then it got into the story. And the story was that one of the two old men had a farm, and I've yet to figure out where it is around. Now that I live in this area, I've even been looking at Google Maps trying to find it. I can't find it. And the farm was, I believe, the farm he grew up on, and it was a cabin, and there were outbuildings. And he and his friend at the table with him had both retired, were both in basically retirement facilities, and he had renters at the farm. And he hadn't heard from them for a couple months or gotten rent. And so he calls up his buddy, picks him up, and they drive down to the farm to see what's up. And they get to the farm, and all the windows are gone from the cabin. They walk into the cabin, the windows are gone, the copper wire is gone, the plumbing is gone, the appliances are gone.
Whoa.
They gutted the place. So these two old guys sit there. I think they were in their 80s. Actually, I'm sure they were at least in their 80s. They could have been older. And apparently had a discussion with each other about what they were currently doing, which was sitting in a retirement home not doing anything. And they took a look at the farm and the possibilities and decided, we're sitting in a retirement home doing nothing, sort of just waiting to die. Why don't we just get out and start doing something again? So they're telling us about that, and then the fellow who owned the farm looks at us. He says, "Do you want to come see? Because we've already set up a sawmill there."
Ooh, great.
So we head down there. So we say, "Sure." They finish up their lunch, and we go for a drive with them. And we find this little farm, and they put the windows back in the cabin, and they're planning on restoring the cabin, and I believe moving back into it. They have a World War II sawmill set up on the hillside under a sort of shelter, and with a big engine on it, and they've got that running. They have tractors, I think, from the 1930s that they're hauling out of the forest and working on getting those going again. And the sawmill they had with them on the trailer was the second sawmill that they were going to set up, because their attitude was, since we're sitting doing nothing, we might as well just do something until we can't anymore.
Like that approach?
Yeah, so that was, and that was a great sort of mentality piece to me too, of just sort of why stop doing anything? Because they stopped doing something, they had something happen, then they realized there's no reason to stop doing anything. We're just sitting. Let's keep going. And it was something that reminded me a little bit of my grandparents, who, until they physically couldn't, they had their little property in New Hampshire, where they raised all of their fruits and vegetables. They had a lake. When they couldn't row across the lake anymore to the island, they transplanted the berries they liked to pick back to their property. And then they had young folks in the neighborhood who started helping them out with things. It was just sort of a community, a growing community, almost reminiscent of sort of what you see at the barn.
Mm-hmm.
Just all different ages doing different things.
Beautiful.
So that's my first story. And that was, go ahead.
You say, you reminded me, I need to stop in and talk to these guys sometime. Every time I drive up here, a little north of Frederick, I'm actually passing, someone has set up, it looks like an old Frick sawmill, right there on 15.
Oh, cool.
'Cause I passed by and one day I saw the mill set up and I saw a sign that said slab wood for sale and had some bundles of the slabs. That's the size of the logs they cut off to get to the square wood in the middle. It's not really good for much. It's good for firewood basically. You can buy bundles of slab wood for next to nothing to use burn as firewood. And then every time I go by, I see more and more logs. And today I went by and I saw some trucks with some logs. Need to stop in there and talk to them and find out what they've got in the way of lumber for sale. Because, like you said, if you're actually trying to do a particular historic restoration, most of your modern mills are band mills, and so when they cut the wood, it's a distinctive saw pattern that's on the rough cut lumber versus a circular mill.
And the neat thing is these local people cutting the lumber, you're getting oftentimes much better lumber than the amazing twisty stuff that you get at Lowe's and Home Depot.
Oh yeah, well that can be a whole topic of how and why that is, and actually has some of it even has to do with tax laws and stuff too.
Oh no, okay.
It's another rabbit hole.
It's another rabbit hole that I can already hear people like shutting off things and running away. So we won't go down that way. So so your first story is the old men with their sawmills. And if you ever want to see one of those operating, all you have to do is go to like they call them thresher reunions or steam shows. There's usually one set up at one of those where they're showing how they cut the lumber on them. It's really cool. So that rolls into my next couple stories, where one of them was how I got to meet and get to know a little bit a Amish carriage maker. Now I used to live in southern Maryland, where we had a good-sized Amish community, and they're honestly they're very often quite down to earth, quite funny, quite great to work with people. And if I went to an auction in southern Maryland, literally a good portion of the people there would be Amish. If I go to a steam show, there's a good portion of the people there will be Amish. And so several years ago, I think it was Hurricane Isabel, when it rolled into Maryland, if I remember correctly, there was a storm surge that flooded up to Baltimore. And I had an acquaintance through working at Fire Museum Maryland who had a book printing and binding business, and the business was on the lower level of his house, which was on the water, which was completely flooded, and the power was out for quite a while. So my friend, now known as Father Navicki, says, "Hey, I have a generator? Why don't we go down there, set up pumps, and we can pump it out and help them out?" In the process of all that, years before, Navicki had researched and reconstructed a Civil War ambulance. And then something happened and somebody sold it out from under him. Well, we're going through this guy's place, trying to rescue things from the bookbinder. He got the pumps running. And Navicki comes out and looks at me and he says, "My ambulance is in the basement." And so what he does is he goes and makes an offer to the fellow to see if he can buy it and see if he can buy it from him. It's in pieces. There's sections that are rotted and everything. And his name was Walter, or Walt. I think Walt just looked at me and said, "You're here with your generator and pumps saving my business. I don't know what happened with whoever you owned that with, but it's yours. You can't pay me for it." So we go back later and we pick up the remains of the ambulance, and Vicky takes it to a carriage maker in Lancaster. And it's an Amish carriage maker, and so got to go up a couple times and see his shops. And everything was run off of, seemed to be like run off of pneumatics, not hitched up to electric. It was when I learned that they could have a sort of outhouse out by the road if they were a business that had a telephone and an answering machine in it. And he did amazing work, and he did almost nothing for the Amish at that point, which I think disturbed him a bit, because they had like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller carriages in there. I mean, the stuff that he was working on was insanely high level. And he had these wonderful rants. I mean, you'd walk in and you could ask him, he'd make it very clear. He says, "Oh, the sociology classes from the colleges come down here." He says, I tell him to ask anything. He says, "Ask me anything." Vicky one time sort of prods him a little bit about some of the tourist billboards, and he went into a rant about those. I think the funniest rant he ever had was how much he wanted a guitar.
Really?
Yeah, he just wanted a guitar, and he sat there just talking about wanting a guitar, but the elders in his community would not allow him to have a guitar or allow anybody in that community to have a guitar because of rock and roll. And he sits there saying, I can have an accordion. He says, I can have an accordion, but I cannot have a guitar. I just want a guitar. And it's funny, if you watch the Amish community, some of them will allow some things, other ones will allow other things. But he was amazing to visit. And just, I think at one point he'd done a hunting carriage that was just such a level of polish. It was absolutely amazing. So that's Amish craftsman number one. Any interjections, thoughts?
No, I mean, just to say, you've worked tertiary to the Amish, and so have I. Living in this area, if you're outside the area, the Amish appears to just be a monolithic culture. But as you said, it's every community is different, just as every Christian denomination is different.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's in fact the area that we live in right now, that the barn is in, Littlestown. In 2020, right after schools had shut down, I'm working in my office in the house, and I have a screen door open on the front of the building, and I hear clop, 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 and immediately I'm just sitting there going, Amish? We don't have Amish. And I didn't see him that day, but then the next day I hear it again, and I run out the door and I catch there's about a 10-year-old boy going up our main street on an open carriage. And since 2020, we've had well over 100 Amish families move into the area. They're buying up the old farms. A lot of like farms that have just been laying sort of decrepit for years, and they're restoring them. In some cases where the house is very close to the road, they will restore the house and rent it out and build their own house farther back. Now they're setting up little farm shops around. They're very excited. We even had a chance a little while back to do World War II living history, and turned around at one point at an event, and there was an Amish couple standing by our rifle display with all sorts of wonderful questions about the rifle display, and I realized I'm interpreting World War II history to the Amish, I was just like, that's new one for me after doing that for about 25 years. So my last story for the evening was I had a friend, I think it was out towards Pittsburgh, Drew, who invited me out years ago. We both had World War II Jeeps. We both reenacted together. And he invited me out to his place for a couple days. And there was a person he wanted me to meet when I came out there. So they had Amish communities surrounding them. And so he takes me out to this beautifully kept farm one day. And there's a little building that's a workshop. Now, I always wear it's summer, so I'm miserable and I'm wearing a t-shirt right now. But I usually wear vest, pocket watch, nice slacks, fedora, etc., wear a Stetson. And so I'm very into antique watches, obviously. And we go there, and this little workshop is a watch shop run by this Amish fellow. And Drew introduces me to him and gives me a tour of his shop and the pneumatic run equipment and lathes and everything in there. And apparently what had happened was he'd been a farmer, and he had a heart attack. And the community decided that what he could still do that was useful, that wouldn't kill him, was he could become a watchmaker. So they put him through watchmaking school. And he set up this beautiful little watch shop, gorgeous pocket watch he was wearing. But apparently the real reason for me to go out there and meet him, and we're coming full circle on the tools and the workshops and the building and everything, was he looks at me at one point and he says, Drew says you work on radios. And I said to him, yes. And he says, old tube radios. And I said, yes, those are the ones that I work on. And he looks at me, sort of looks around, and then stares at me and goes, we can't have those, right? And hangs his head. And I stared at him. And I said, yeah, I know you can't have those. And he says, but I have all sorts of questions. And so we have this discussion about the radios for several minutes. And then he tells me, so some folks will remember a store called Radio Shack, that just had wonderful electronics and everything in it. You may have had a computer from there. I had all sorts of stuff from there as a kid. I miss the store dearly. And apparently, one of his English friends, and if you don't know the Amish, they call us, those of us driving around with cars with cell phones and stuff like that, the English. One of his English friends, every couple of weeks, would drive him down to a Radio Shack nearby, and he would stand outside. He would stand outside the Radio Shack and stare in the window. And his treat was to stand out there and stare in the window for an hour at all the different things he wasn't allowed to touch. He told me about that, and we talked more electronics and radio questions for a bit after that, and then Drew and I headed out. That started. That's a bit of a ramble, and we had a bit of a debate earlier. What was our debate earlier about rambles?
Oh, walking rambles or sitting around rambles?
Yeah, so this was not a walking ramble. This was a sitting around ramble on tools and detours and neat people involved with crafting things and creating and getting off their butts and doing. So, do you have any concluding thoughts to throw in for the evening, Matt?
Well, just it's kind of funny we talked about tools tonight. So I've always collected old tools. I like to use old tools, and right now I'm transitioning down a little bit of a rabbit hole of learning how to use old tools the old way. So that is my current fetish is not reading history books, but reading books that are actually old. So I'm reading a reprint right now of a book on house building, carpentry, and joinery that's from 1840.
Oh, that's too cool.
And so it's not how houses were built in 1840. It's just, no, this is an instruction manual. This is an instruction manual to tradesmen that is just at its in its time. And so I find myself discovering words and phrases and having to go back and look things up. And the first section of the book is geometry. And then later in the book, there's an explanation of a shape of a chisel using words that I didn't know existed. I had to go back to the geometry section because I had skipped it because I'm not good with numbers. But it turns out they were really important to even understand. And so it's as you dive into if you dive into tools, you can really dive into history in a different way and experience it in a different way than just than even reading even the best history books.
You can even find Matt at some World War II reenactments with a shop set up called Iffy Lube, which I absolutely. What's the motto of Iffy Lube?
Service like this should be extinct.
Yes, and they have a dodo on their. They have a dodo as their mascot, and they set up a full World War II shop working on Jeeps and such with World War II tools. But we could keep going down that rabbit hole, but we'll stop here for the evening. Hopefully you enjoyed those. Hopefully you enjoyed our tool ramble. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Merlin's Barn. And if you have stories, rambles, detours that you have taken, and you want to share them with us, you can find us on Instagram at Merlin's Barn. You can email us. Email is probably the best, and that is Merlin's Barn, MERLINSBARN @gmail.com. And we'll be setting up other social media as we go along. So you're all wonderful. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.
Bye now.